Hey, I'm James. Welcome to Game Stories Deep Dive. This time around, we are looking at Persuasive Games by Ian Bogost. It's a book, and it's a sort of important one in game studies. We are not going to go all the way in depth with this. We're not going to look at all of his chapters or pick through the whole thing. My goal for this video is to give you a sense of basically his core concept in this book, which is procedural rhetoric. So he's going to argue that games can be persuasive, they can make arguments, they can be sort of important, and they can make a difference in people's lives, or they can make sort of claims on the way people think. So we want to look at how he thinks they do that, so we can get a better idea of what we might be shooting for when we make our own games. Before we get too into the weeds with Bogost, let's look at a video game that he references in his book as an example, because I think it will probably help if we look at the game first and then the quotes that I've pulled. I think the quotes will make more sense that way. So let's look at the game, which is the McDonald's game. It is a self-announced digital parody of McDonald's and is intended solely for the purposes of entertainment and education and is no way to represent actual persons, blah, blah, blah. That's their legal disclaimer, but it's also sort of a statement of purpose, which is we're going to kind of make fun of and critique the McDonald's corporation through this game. Let's see how they do that. So if we start a new game, we'll notice that there are 4 basic screens that we can interact with here. There's the farm screen, where we can plant soybean crop, which will feed our cattle. And we can raise cattle. We can even sort of maximize the number of cattle on each space. So that's good. We're going to have cows for our hamburgers. Inside here, we can this is the slaughterhouse, where we're feeding the cattle and fattening them up and then killing them. You can see our food supply is running low. We're going to need soybeans pretty soon. If we run out of feed, we need to go back over here and make sure that maybe we add GMOs to our fields so that we get a better yield. That'll give us a little bit more crop for the feed. We can also add extra stuff. We can add like growth hormone and industrial waste to our food, and we can even add the leftover cattle back into our feed, so we can feed cows other cows, and maybe that'll create some problems. We'll see. Here's the restaurant. We got some burgers in the back, which is good, and we can hire workers to make burgers and hire workers to sell them. And if we've got that, then customers will come in and buy our hamburgers. We've got corporate headquarters. They're happy now because I'm selling hamburgers. And we can put these guys to work, the ad writers. We can put them to work on a campaign to advertise to children. We can activate that. That should bring in even more customers and make the bosses happy. Let's see, yeah, there's a long line now. So let's add another worker and another worker. Oh, the boss is worried. Too many people. All right, let's sell some more stuff. We can also interact with these workers. If they're not doing a good job, we can scold them or fire them and replace them or give them a merit badge. Every once in a while, something like this will pop up. Consumer associations are concerned. They're feeling sick after eating the hamburgers. What are we going to do about that? Well, it might be because we're putting nasty stuff in our food. But we can go over here to the PR department and... oh yeah, they still don't like it. Let's corrupt a health officer. We can get a doctor to say that our food is actually healthy, and maybe that will make the problem go away. Problem over here, no cows. Once these cows are sort of big enough, they'll get picked up by machines and taken over to the other place. But eventually, in order to sort of meet the demand that we have and to keep things profitable, we will need to keep expanding these fields, creating more feed and more cattle, because you can see I need more cows so that I don't have this situation. I don't want a situation where I've got no cows, so I need to keep expanding. And eventually that's going to mean plowing over some rainforest. When I run out of rainforest, I'm probably going to have to take down this village. Ooh, and that's not, the anti-globalization movements are not going to like that. So let's get the PR people involved. Let's get them to corrupt a politician. He'll say that what we're doing is important. So I think at this point you can basically see how this game works. Bad things will happen. We'll have to cope with them through clever PR moves. The goal is to be profitable. I'm not doing a good job of that right now because I sort of built too much infrastructure without carefully building things up. And I don't have a regular supply of cattle coming in, so that's bad. But you're basically managing all these things. You're managing the land over here, which eventually gets spoiled by the cows, you can see. You're managing the slaughterhouse, where you're trying to keep it full and try to even keep the feed full. And balancing, if cows get sick, you have to burn them instead of slaughtering them and turning them into meat. So you're sort of worried about that. You have to worry about worker productivity and customers here, and then sort of managing the public perception of the whole enterprise from the corporate space. So that's probably enough of that to get a basic idea of what we're doing. So, what does Bogost say? He says, in general, video games are an expressive medium. They represent how real and imagined systems work. They invite players to interact with those systems and form judgments about them. And I think we can see that working pretty clearly in the McDonald's game, which is that game was designed to express something, which is sort of a distaste for the McDonald's corporation and the way it operates in the world. And it does that by representing how real, in this case, real systems work. Unless I guess you don't think McDonald's works that way, then you would say it's an imagined system. But for the sake of the game, they're actually parodying a real thing, which is McDonald's, right? So they're representing how the real systems of McDonald's works, which is we need cows to slaughter them. We have to manage that in a way that it's highly productive. So we might use genetically modified foods. We might sort of fill the feedstock with something less than savory. And then we'll use a bunch of advertising money to sell that to people, sell that to customers. It invited players to interact with the systems. We were sort of directly interacting with all those systems, which interacted with each other, right? We were doing the farming, we were doing the PR, we were doing the managing the restaurant, and we're supposed to form judgments about them, which is through interacting with all these things, we're supposed to see how complex they are. But we're also supposed to see how, the profit motive kind of drives a bunch of behaviors that are not necessarily good for consumers, right? It's in my interest to use GMOs. It's in my interest to fill the feedstock of the cattle with, leftover slaughtered meat, which can cause, mad cow disease. And toxic waste and growth hormones and stuff like that are probably not too good for people to end up eating. So I'm supposed to get this kind of critique forming in my mind about how a corporation like McDonald's operates. Bogost says that's true about all video games, not just something like the McDonald's game. So I think he sort of moderates his claim later in the book where he says he's particularly interested in games that do this, make a point of this, right? And the examples that he points to are games that are all about making these arguments. And not all games are kind of about that in the same way, even though arguably they do make some kind of argument. Okay. Video games open a new domain for persuasion thanks to their core representational mode, procedurality. I call this a new form of procedural rhetoric, the art of persuasion through rule-based representations and interactions rather than spoken word, writing, images, or moving pictures. So when people speak, they can persuade you. They can try to change your mind about something. That's also true when people write or take pictures or make paintings, and also true when they make movies. So movies make arguments, novels make arguments, newspaper articles make arguments, presidents make arguments when they give speeches. Any kind of expressive medium can kind of make a persuasive claim at you. You might not buy it, you may not believe it, but it's going to try to get you to think or feel something different than you did before. And he says that that's also true of games. Games are not an exception to this. They're not just for fun. They're also participating in culture, and they also make persuasive claims on their players. He says that pretty clearly right here. Video games can disrupt and change fundamental attitudes and beliefs about the world, leading to potentially significant long-term social change. This power lies in the very way video games mount claims through procedural rhetorics. So games can matter. They can be important. They can mean something. They can change the way that you think about the world. They can change the way you feel about things. And they can do that based on the way that they invite you to interact with their systems. So a little bit more in depth about that. Procedural representation explains processes explains processes with other processes. Procedural representation itself requires inscription in a medium that actually enacts processes rather than merely describing them. That's a heavy sentence. So what he's saying here is that in order to do the kind of argumentation that games do, it has to be about some kind of process in the world, some kind of system, and it's representing that system with another system. So the McDonald's game is about McDonald's. It's making an argument about McDonald's. And the way that it does that is that it represents the kind of systems that are at work in the McDonald's Corporation through video game systems, right? Through the kind of variable modulation that's happening behind the scenes and the kind of interactive features that it has. The way that the game is running is meant to represent the way that McDonald's is running, right? So a process is explaining and making an argument about another kind of process. You can't do that in a book, not very well. You can't do it in a movie. In order to represent processes with other processes, you have to have a medium that allows you to enact processes, not just describe them. So I could write you an article about how McDonald's works, but that's not going to lead to the same kind of persuasive work that giving you a game does. In the game, you can actually interact with those things and play around with them and try to win the McDonald's game. And in that way, you come to a different kind of understanding of McDonald's than you would just by reading about it. So what else? I understand procedurality as the fundamental notion of authoring processes. Why did I put that quote? Oh, actually, the next three quotes are just sort of about what it means to be a writer, a game writer, I think. In this case, he's seeing game authors as authors of processes, authors of systems. So when we're thinking about the game stories we're writing, we should be thinking, and this will be more clear the deeper we get into variables, we should be thinking about the kind of systems that are at work in our game and how those systems relate or fail to relate to real world systems. Does the kind of representation in my game, the kind of systems and math behind the scenes, does that relate in any way to something in the real world or something that I want players to imagine in a world? And is it doing a good job of that, right? He says procedural rhetoric is a general name for the practice of authoring arguments through processes. So not only am I doing a good job of representation, but am I making something meaningful in that representation? Am I doing something that players will come away with some kind of new understanding about the world because I've represented things in a certain way and allowed them to participate in a certain kind of interactivity? Am I giving them a meaningful experience? Procedural rhetoric is not automatically a part of computational expression, and a great deal of attention is required to construct coherent, let alone effective, procedural rhetorics. In other words, he's kind of backing off his claim a little bit about all video games do this. And he's saying it's not automatic. You can't just make a game and say, look, I'm doing procedural rhetoric. He's saying, and actually, you have to sort of sit down with your game and think about its design in a lot of depth and think about how you want it to make claims on the player, what kinds of choices you want to give to the player, what sorts of systems are they interacting with, how do the systems respond to their choices, and in what way does that represent some kind of real world phenomenon. So it's a lot to think about. It's pretty heavy. He's asking us to take a pretty deep view of the game systems we're working with and think very carefully and construct them very carefully to to persuade our players, right? To make them think about something, to make them feel differently about something. All right, I got another quote here, and let's see. Last one. Sophisticated interactivity means greater responsiveness, tighter symbolic coupling between user actions and procedural representations. Sophisticated interactivity can produce more sophisticated procedural rhetoric. What's he talking about there? So interactivity, we know, is when players make choices and the game responds to those choices, right? We're interacting with the systems of the game. More sophisticated interactivity means that the game is more responsive and there's a tighter symbolic coupling between our actions and procedural representations. That means our actions are very close to a result. The game gives us lots of feedback about what we're doing and shows us exactly the systems that we're interacting with. Not all games do that. Some games have a lot of systems that work behind the scenes, and the player only interacts with sort of a superficial level of that and never really knows how their actions are impacting that sort of deeper math or deeper process that's going on behind the scenes. That can be an important choice. That can be sort of an artistic choice that you make to sort of hide most of the work your game is doing behind the scenes. And it can work. It can work really well. Bogost is saying that if you want to do this kind of argumentation, though, it's probably more effective to let readers or your players see what they're interacting with, see the systems at work, and then give them feedback about how their actions are impacting those systems. And again, the McDonald's game is a good example of that because you can see what kind of choices you have and how they impact the production of cattle, the wear and tear on the land, the health of your customers, profit margins, public demand for certain kinds of activity, and so forth. So the systems are pretty transparent and your actions are really tightly coupled with those systems. Okay, so that's a lot to sort of take in. But the basic gist of this is games can be important. They can matter in the world. Games can also make arguments. They can be persuasive to their players. And they do that, according to Bogost, primarily through giving them the opportunity to interact with representative systems. Let's look at another example of that I don't think Bogost covers, but is a little bit closer to the kind of work that we've been doing in this series so far. So this is a game called Depression Quest. It was built in Twine. And just like the name implies, it's meant to sort of represent the processes that are at work in someone who's depressed. So the things that are represented here, the kinds of interactivity we have here, are all about the choices of a depressed person and the way that those influence their state of depression. Let's read through a couple passages and look at the choices we've got and see how it works. This is, I think, the first passage in the game where there's actually some choices. It says, it's an unseasonably warm Wednesday evening. You spent the past several hours at work. The past week or so, you've found your job motivation flagging more so than usual. You've been in a fog practically all day today, simply going through the motions without realizing even what you've been doing half the time, and yet seem to be moving at half the speed. You're so checked out that when your boss approaches you to tell you that it's dead and you can go home early, it barely registers. So a depressed day at work, you go home. By the time you arrive at home and change out of your uncomfortable work clothes, the stress is weighing down on you like a heavy, wet wool blanket. Your computer seems to be staring you down from your desk. You want to sit down and work, but the mere thought of trying to work sends your stress levels flying. More than anything, you feel suddenly and absolutely exhausted and feel a strong desire to simply hide in bed. Do you? And here's your choices. Order some food, grab a drink, and hunker down for a night of work, which is crossed out in red, and I'm not able to click on it. 2, reluctantly sit down at your desk and try to make yourself do something. 3, turn on the TV, telling yourself you just need a quick half hour to unwind from work. 4, crawl into bed, you're so stressed and overwhelmed you couldn't possibly accomplish anything anyways. So the most productive thing to do, maybe, or certainly the most energetic and engaged thing to do, is this first one. Order food, grab a drink, and get to work. But I can't do that. I can't click on that. It offers me a choice. It offers me the appearance of a choice, but clearly highlights that I'm not able to do that, which in a way represents the depression, right? I kind of know, this character knows, I'd really like to be able to do that, but I can't. It's not an option for me. I have to do one of these other things. So I could sit down and try to do it, or I could just sort of crawl into bed. And you can see as we go down the list, this one is sort of the most depressed one, I think. Is the way the game is trying to represent it, is like this is just sort of given in. I'm too overwhelmed, I can't do anything, we're just going to bed. And this is the more productive one, which is like, I'll just fight through it and try to do something. I'll point out one more thing, which is down here, there's some feedback the game is giving me about the state of the depression, right? It says, I'm depressed, which is sort of, it'll say that this could get worse and worse over the course of the game. Interaction is exhausting, you're becoming more and more withdrawn. And then a couple more statements. You're not currently seeing a therapist, you're not currently taking medication for depression. So, which kind of indicates to me, probably I want to do both of those things if I want to be doing better with my depression. See a therapist and take medication, at least according to the game. So let's do the depressed thing and see where it goes. I'm not gonna have time to read through all these passages, but things don't go so well. I missed some calls, and then it gives me a next option. And then it says it's a mild Friday afternoon. Alex, that's my girlfriend, calls you from one of her classes telling you that there's going to be a really awesome birthday party. And I can shake off my funk and go have a good time. Not an option. Too depressed for that. I can agree to go, or say that you're really just not feeling well and can't make it. Let's just cop out of this. And go next. Now in the next passage, I just want to show you that two things are crossed off. I made a couple of pretty depressed decisions, and it looks like things are getting worse. Now it's saying you are deeply depressed. Before it was just regular old depressed. Now it's deeply depressed. That doesn't sound good. And I have fewer options now. Alex is sort of worried about me. She wants to talk. Let her know that you've been feeling down lately and that you appreciate her concern. Can't do that. That's a healthy thing to do. It's sort of honest and upfront, but I can't seem to bring myself to do it. Try to be honest with her anyway. Can't do that either. Tell her that everything is fine and thank her for asking, which is sort of like blowing it off, pushing it, kicking the can down the road in the relationship, basically, or just change the subject. I want to go back really quick and make some different decisions and show you how the game responds. See if I can get back to the first passage. Yeah. On unseasonably warm Wednesday evening. Let's get to work this time. Let's try to do some work even though we don't feel like it. So I kind of get some things done. Not great, but I did try. At least I tried. Then we have the mild afternoon, and there's this party. We'll agree to go. We experience a bunch of social anxiety. It's kind of tough. What do we do? I'm going to pick this one. Cling to the back wall, sip your beer, and wait for your girlfriend to return. She sort of invites us to this party. We're hanging out. She sort of bails for a while and goes to talk to other people. We don't feel comfortable talking to anybody. We have to sort of stand here somewhere, and we can either like get really drunk, hide in the back room, awkwardly stand in the same spot, or just kind of play it cool. We're going to play it cool. Sip my beer. So she's happy that we came to the party. Relationship's going okay. And when we get to here, I'm very depressed. Not quite as bad as I was when I made the bad decisions, but it's not great. But now notice I have more options. Last time I came to this passage, two things were crossed out. Now there's just one thing crossed out. I can't do sort of the most engaged and upfront thing, but now I can do the second most engaged and upfront thing. I made some healthier choices. I made some choices to kind of resist the pull of the depression and try to stay engaged anyway. And because of that, I'm now able to make more decisions like that. I'm able to make more decisions that kind of resist the pull of the depression and try to keep going anyway. When I made decisions to kind of give into the feeling of depression and despair, I ended up in a situation where I could make less decisions to resist it. So the game is representing depression as the system of choices, right? If I make choices, according to Depression Quest, if I make choices that fight against the depression and try to do some kind of active thing, then I don't know that my state will improve, but it will at least not get worse. And I'll be able to continue to make choices that kind of struggle to maintain a certain level of depression, not too much, right? But if I start giving into it, then the depression will start taking some of my agency away. It'll start taking choices away from me. I'll know that I should be at least able to be honest with her, but now I can't, right? If I've done the more depressed choices or the more giving in choices. Whether or not that's an accurate model of depression is kind of up to you to consider. But for sure, the game and through its systems is asking you to engage in the kind of choices that a depressed person would have to make, and then giving you feedback based on those choices. Meaning, as you give into your depression, you get more depressed, and as you kind of resist it, you kind of maintain. There's no ending where you're like happy forever, and there's no ending where you completely die. You're just sort of moderating your severity of depression based on the choices that you have. So I think that's a pretty good, and if you've been working through the series so far, you can probably figure out how they did this through use of Boolean variables, right? Or use of numeric variables, probably. Giving you a certain level of depression and saying if it's this high, then you get this many choices, but if it's this low, then you get that many choices. I think that's a pretty good example, too, of what Bogost is talking about. This is an expressive game. It's trying to express the experience of depression. It's representing how a real system works. It's a system inside of people, right? The system of depression. And it's inviting us to interact with a representation of that system, a representation of depression, in order to form judgments, maybe change our opinions about how depression works. It's engaging in procedural rhetoric. The author of this game sort of authored these processes, which, in order to represent this phenomenon, and sort of crafted the story so that we can experience that, right? Whether or not this disrupts and changes your fundamental attitudes or beliefs about the world or not is, anybody's guess. I think for some people, it will probably allow them to think differently about what depression is, and for some people, it won't. Right? Do we need to look at any more of these? How sophisticated the interactivity was it's not like super deep. It's not as deep as the McDonald's interactivity was, for sure, right? But it's deep enough that you sort of get the sense that if I were in a situation like this, making these choices, maybe the game would kind of go this way. Maybe my depression would kind of go this way too. Right? So it's sophisticated enough to make its point about depression. So, what are the take-home messages about all this? Just that as we move forward, and as you're making more games, and as you're writing more stories that are interactive, as you get more sophisticated with your uses of variables and such, think about this. Think about how am I representing, through the choices that I allow players to make, how am I representing the systems, maybe even the systems inside of a person, sort of personality systems. How am I representing things that will affect the way that the player thinks about the world I've created, or about the real world, or about the characters in the world, or about experiences that people have in life, right? What am I doing with this kind of representation that could be meaningful to somebody? And I think that's it for this time. So keep it in mind that as we move forward, try to make something meaningful. Think about how things are represented. All right? And we'll see you next time.